All right. Welcome everybody to this live session. It's conversation about peer-led dialogue. So I'm joined right now by Caleb Cohoe, who
Hello.
needs no introduction for this group, but I guess I'm going to introduce him anyway. Caleb teaches at Metropolitan State University, and I guess as some background for this session, I was out there in the spring to work with some dialogue leaders Caleb selected for his course. I'm going to mute myself. I have the Facebook Live open here. And so he set up a dialogue leaders program, a dialogue program for his course. And I'll ask you first off, Caleb, can you just tell us a little bit about how peer-led dialogue exists at MSU and in your course in particular?
Yeah, so let me start with the nature of the course. So the course I was using it in is an Introduction to Ethics course, so not specifically philosophy as a way of life. It's one of our standard introductory courses. This is how we recruit majors and minors, students with no background, and it's a general studies course. So most of them have been directed to it to fulfill those requirements. And a little, unlike the Notre Dame God in the Good Life course, it needs to have in-depth coverage of 3 different periods using primary sources. So those are the constraints. And so it's not going to be a different theme every week. Instead, we go a little more into extended readings and engagements with some key thinkers. But who those are up to the instructor. So I've done a bunch of different versions: Epictetus, Aquinas, Plato's Republic, Annette Bayer. The version I was doing now, though, we do Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Susan Wolf on Meaning and Life, early Buddhist philosophy and views on attachment and desire, and Blaise Pascal on meaning and happiness. So that's the key figures we look at. And then it's 2 75-minute sessions a week. That's our time frame. And I'm just leading those. They're about 30 people, though the number might keep going up per class. So what I did was basically have either half of one session or one full session every 2 weeks, or half a session every week devoted to that. So roughly 30 to 40 minutes a week for peer dialogue.
Good. So just so I'm tracking, Caleb, I think you laid this out very clearly. So say it's Monday and Wednesday, you got 75 minutes each of those days. Instead of having like a separate dialogue session, like we do here at Notre Dame, you built the dialogue into those sessions. So you either gave 30 minutes in the Monday and the Wednesday, or maybe like 60 minutes on one of those, but you built it into the instructional time.
That's right. Because we're a commuter institution, we don't have students on campus. A lot of people have very tight schedules. So I couldn't ask or arrange for outside time. So instead, this is a priority, and it fits with some of these exercise, philosophy as a way of life exercises we were already doing, that now we're doing in a new way within the context of the class itself. So the students prepare and do the exercises as their homework, and then the discussion with these peer leaders takes place within class time.
That's awesome. So can I ask you a bit about how you got it set up? I know part of it because I was out there at MSU and had a chance to talk with your dialogue fellows. We should maybe mention too that you had 2 of them for this particular course. But what sort of resources or departments or units on campus did you draw on? Or where did you kind of, like, what did you do when you decided I want to start one of these programs?
Yeah, so I checked in with our Center for Applied Learning and internships. So one thing that our institution and a lot of institutions are very keen on is students applying their learning in some way. So this, for the student leaders, was designated as an internship that would both count for philosophy credits. So they got 3 credits in philosophy and wrote an extensive paper on philosophy as a way of life, as well as doing the readings and leading. But then the other half was developing their leadership skills and these other sort of job ready, connecting to career, and the kind of skills that these centers are looking for. And because this was a new program and this is the first time the philosophy department had ever offered an internship, we were able to get that Center for Applied Learning to cover what it would cost for their tuition, so the students didn't have to pay extra for the extra credits they were getting for being student leaders. So we got some support there, and then we had a stipend as well, $1,000, and that could be
that's
for
great.
the semester.
So with that, so I didn't actually realize this when we were setting this up, but so the students, the peer-led dialogue leaders, got credit for leading the dialogue each class, like academic credit, sort of like practicum credit as well.
Yeah,
That's really
so
cool.
it counted as a philosophy internship, and then it also goes in their package of skills, and they have the leadership, facilitation, skills, and part of their internship was documenting that.
That's awesome. Let me share my screen really quick. This helps us bookmark, especially after the fact if people are watching. So we just talked a little bit about how dialogue works at MSU. I want to ask you now, why did you decide to use the peer-led dialogue method in your course? And maybe you could also reflect on the ongoing value of it if you'll decide to do it again. So I'll just pose that to you.
Yeah, so I was interested in this because I'd already been using a number of philosophy as a way of life exercises in my class. So when we're doing Aristotle, have them think about what are their goals in life, what are their values, how are they going to get there. With Pascal, evaluating whether the things they're looking forward to actually end up giving them as much happiness as they thought prospectively. So I had a number of application assignments like that students were doing, and then I'd mostly just been having them turn them in, and then I'd read them and basically give complete or not complete. And sometimes we talk about them a little in class, but it was a little hard because I'm the teacher, I'm the one with a PhD, and in a somewhat different life situation and background from some of my students. So I thought it'd be really helpful to have students be able to discuss among themselves and with peers at a similar place in their life. And also in this 30-person class, we were then able to get 2 discussion leaders divided in half, and then students, it's not always 100% attendance, so it's more like 8 to 12 students in a group discussing these exercises and sharing. So I thought that was more effective, both the smaller group, and then for these sessions, I would go out of the room. We managed to get 2 different spaces, so we used our department's seminar room as well as the standard classroom that had been assigned for the course, and one group would stay in the classroom, one would go to the seminar room. I'd step out for a little, the discussion leaders would take over, and then I'd check back in and sort of sit at the back of the room. But that way it was really peer-led, and it made for a different kind of conversation and atmosphere.
Yeah, so in a way, we're about to answer this question just by like sort of showing rather than telling, because in a second, we're going to have a peer-led dialogue fellow leader. Sorry, there's just so many different ways of referring to them, but we're going to have 2 of the leaders, the actual dialogue leaders, join us, one from Notre Dame and then one from MSU. So in a second, you're going to see why we trust these students to be in a room alone with other students leading these dialogues. But I guess I will pose this to you, Caleb. Was it a worry for you beforehand to think like, okay, I'm going to train these undergraduates, but then they're leading instructional time during my course and I'm not in the room? Like, in order to sort of, set the right tone, I can't be in the room. Were you worried about that?
Yeah, definitely. Partly, I really trusted the people I had, and it was nice that I had students who I taught before, so I knew something about them, and Paul had some helpful training for me and for them. But just giving up that control and giving up that time, I want to make sure, it's a lot to cover all these thinkers in 15 weeks. But I ended up feeling like it really was a good use of time, especially for students. Most of our students aren't going to become majors, so they've got this one course, and this seems to me one of the best ways to really get them reflecting on what the good life looks like for them, engaging with these very disparate views on, say, whether we should be rationally ordering our desires via Aristotle, or just giving up and detaching from them on the Buddhist view, whether we can achieve happiness and meaning, or with Pascal, it's not something possible in this life. That can be kind of abstract if we don't do these kind of exercises, and I think that the dialogue leaders provided a better atmosphere for that than I would have been able to just as a professor.
That's awesome. So in a way, you just answered this. My question was going to be, at the end of the experiment, do you think it was worth it? But maybe I'll make it more specific and ask, how do you know as an instructor whether this experiment is succeeding? So, there are various ways that if we come in and help train, we'll say, here's some assessment mechanisms, but still, just apart from this, how do you know whether that is time well spent, either during the semester? Do you, what do you sort of use to measure the success of these dialogue sessions, or even afterwards, just big picture, kind of looking back, like how do you figure out, like, yeah, that was a successful experiment? And I'll warn our viewers that as Caleb's answering, our fellows are probably going to arrive and they'll jump into the Zoom, so don't be alarmed. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Caleb?
I think the thing that was most convincing for me was just seeing more students participate and be more open and be able to share more in the small group sessions than in my larger sessions, where I had a participation system, and I get a pretty wide range of students participating, but it is definitely some more than others, and just hearing how many different life experiences they were bringing in. So I think that was a key factor. And then just it did set things up well for me to sit in the back of the room and figure out what concepts they were getting and which ones they were maybe having a little trouble on, like the distinction between chosen for its own sake versus for the sake of something else. When I hear them try to apply their own examples and they're doing it for the peer leaders and others, I think they're more willing to be open than sometimes students can just be afraid to say things, and then I can't diagnose maybe where we need reinforcement. So I found that really helpful as well.
That's awesome. So there were times, so this is definitely the case at Notre Dame, and it sounds like for you too. So there were times where you would observe the dialogues. You'd go in and see how it's going and kind of listen in.
Yeah, usually for 5 or 10 minutes.
That's great.
And then it was hard. We did, with the whole online switch there, we had a couple small groups where sometimes I'd lead one and Jordan, who we're going to see in a sec, would lead another. There it was hard because I couldn't really just go in because that's very intrusive to the conversation in the video format, as we may see in a minute.
Boom.
But so that part was a little harder, and I'm still thinking about whether and how we can do this in an online teaching environment. So I'd say that was a challenge that we tried a couple things with, but as we all know, it's hard.
Yeah, that's a design challenge for us too. We're definitely going to train our fellows this semester in both formats. It's going to be in person for the start, and then we're just being instructed at the university to prepare for anything. So we might change the drop of a hat. Welcome, Sam and Jordan. Welcome to our dialogue leaders, our guest leaders. Let me turn it over to the two of you and just ask you to introduce yourselves and say a bit about your experience as dialogue leaders. So Sam, as I ask you to introduce yourselves, I want to introduce you. I'm not going to do it. I'm gonna resist the urge. But why don't I turn it over to you, Jordan, first, and yeah, just have you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your experience.
Awesome. Hi, I'm happy to be here. My name is Jordan, as Paul said, and I'm majoring in psychology and philosophy. There's a really loud plane going over. Give me a second.
No worries.
Yeah, and I decided to apply for this position and join in because it seemed like a great opportunity to, I guess, get some practice facilitating discussion, and then to lead people to better understand really cool and important texts. I'm a little biased being a philosophy major, I guess, that I think philosophy is awesome, but to be able to help people apply it to their lives and understand it was really intriguing to me. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Sam.
All right. Hi, everybody. I am a recent graduate from the University of Notre Dame. I graduated in May with a bachelor's in philosophy. I've been working with Notre Dame's God and the Good Life for all of my college career since it started my first year. So I actually experienced the course with graduate student dialogue leaders, and then was in the first cohort of undergraduate dialogue leaders. And I did that for 4 semesters before moving on to the teaching assistant role. And this summer, I've actually been working with Paul and the Mellon Initiative on creating training materials to prepare the first cohorts of dialogue leaders at Wesleyan and Boise State University, which Paul and I are going to lead them through in a few weeks. But I initially decided to apply for the dialogue leader position, not necessarily because I love philosophy like Jordan, but I wasn't a major at the time. But I joined because I loved the course and wanted to continue to be a part of like that course. We were having conversations in dialogue that nobody was having on campus about religion, politics, and race and gender and meaning. And we were doing it as like friends and peers without kind of animosity or antagonism. And as someone whose views didn't necessarily align with the general population of Notre Dame, that really appealed to me. And it was exciting for me to kind of break down that barrier that I felt between me and some of the other kids on campus. Because like once you get to talking, I'm not going to say like the cliche like, oh, we're not so different after all. Like we are very different in a lot of ways, but you realize that the differences are kind of just a product of, you know, different experiences and upbringings and things like that, and you just like understand each other better. So I really appreciated that aspect and love being a dialogue leader and part of a PWOL course for my whole college life.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you for joining us. So I'll just again say directly to the viewers, if anybody has questions for the dialogue leaders, for Caleb, or for me about how dialogue exists at our various institutions, feel free to drop those in the comments. We're going to have our other fellow Kat, who's never been on here but is always behind the scenes. She's curating a list, and so she'll post that for us. But let me just kind of jump on something each of you touched on here. But let me just ask you why you think, assuming you do, and of course you do, this is why we asked you to be, assuming you think that dialogue is a worthwhile thing for undergraduates to do, what I'm wondering is, like, why do you think that from the student's perspective? And Sam, you sort of said something about, you know, you were having meaningful conversations that nobody else on campus was having. For somebody who doesn't get to sit in the room while dialogue's happening, or just kind of jumps in for 5 minutes here or there, you know, what's going on there that is actually really drawing you or engaging you and your peers in that dialogue? Yeah, what are your thoughts? Either of you can go first. Jordan, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely something I was thinking about, as well as the ability to take on some of these, I guess, tougher questions that are always kind of there in the background about what it is to be a human being kind of operating in this world and in this culture. And when the professor leaves the room, I guess you can maybe be more candid because it's like student to student. And so, yeah, like you get to have these unique experiences where like maybe you can share more authentically, or just even areas where you might not have really understood the text because you're hashing it out in conversation. You can maybe find yourself in it that much more. And yeah, like you can think about things much more critically, as opposed to the kind of common thing that you get in classes. My experience of, okay, I'm going to read this and then recite it for the test or the exam. It's like you get the opportunity to have something be much more like meaningful and grounded and integrated with like what you're dealing with on the regular day to day.
That's cool and somewhat surprising for me. I mean, the sort of a perception I often run into is like, well, dialogue sounds great, but it can't be like pedagogically useful. We got to use all the time that we have. But one thing that you just said was, you know, you're working through these questions that you have in the text, and you're kind of clarifying things in addition to this very meaningful conversation that you're having and engaging with peers in. So that's really cool. Sam, you got any thoughts that you want to share beyond?
Yeah, definitely agree with what Jordan said about kind of the authenticity of the sharing when the professor leaves the room or when it's just peer dialogue. And I would also add, just going from that dialogue meeting into like the real world, you have a lot more confidence and like experience having conversations like this, and you're able to like lead them with other people, other peers, or just like your parents or something over Thanksgiving dinner. You're a lot more comfortable like having these kinds of conversations because you've done it in this safe space at the dialogue meetings. And I think like a lot of times, like at Notre Dame specifically, there's kind of this desire to be like very polite and not to offend anybody on campus. And it's easy to take that as like a sign that these 18-year-olds and stuff don't want to talk about these kinds of issues, but we really like do. And it's just, we don't have that space to do it, or the time in our schedules or whatever. So setting aside this time for the dialogue meetings is always really valuable in that sense. And like every year, it's kind of a struggle between our dialogue leaders and the instructors of the course, because the dialogue leaders and the students always want more time for just like simple dialogue, and the instructors always want more time for kind of structured assignments and stuff. And like, I just always think that's crazy to me. Like, think about that for a second. Like, our students love dialogue so much that they want to talk more about that and do more of that than the stuff that they're actually graded on. So it's just like really great. And I think that's a clear indication of like the value of the dialogue to the students.
And good news for any fellows who might be watching. We just met and set all the assignments and decided everything today for GGL at Notre Dame. And we're not going to touch it. We're just going to let the dialogue start and run. And we're really going to, we'll observe. But yeah, we're basically not going to touch it. Caleb, any thoughts that you have here? Any questions that are arising as you listen to the way that Jordan and Sam are describing their experiences as dialogue leaders?
Well, one thing I was really nervous about, well, I think everyone was, is just how it would go at the start, like whether this would work. So I don't know if either of you want to share your mindset and then your experience the first couple sessions, especially when you're trying to get that atmosphere.
Yeah, I think the first couple weeks are definitely pretty awkward at times. But I think it's important to kind of set that tone right away of like, with the dialogue leaders coming with tons of energy and being really excited and interested in hearing what everyone has to say. And I always start my first week with what I call philosophical speed dating, where everyone lines up in a line and you just, I give one question and two people will talk one-on-one with each other for about a minute about that question. And then when the time's up, we like move down one row in the line, and then you talk to a new person. So that kind of sets a tone right away that it's going to be awkward, it's going to be uncomfortable, but you're going to be talking philosophy with each other, and you're going to be, like engaging in conversation with each other, and everybody's going to be participating. So like those kinds of activities to set the tone for the dialogue are super important for later meetings.
So now we're going to have to do socially distanced philosophical speed dating,
Yeah.
but it's totally going to work. It's totally going to work. Yeah, Jordan, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to listen because I'm kind of imagining there are some differences between the bigger classes that you all have over there and the smaller groups. I actually think it might be a little more awkward in the beginning, like couple of weeks, because if there's like 10 of you in the discussion, then it's like, okay, everybody has to say something, like all eyes on you almost. And so to get past that in the first couple of weeks was it was definitely just something to be with, I guess. And so icebreaker questions and little exercises to kind of get us thinking, so we can just get more comfortable with each other as a group. Over time, eventually it was like, okay, cool, this is the group that you're going to be with. And we divided the class the same every time. So I think creating that safety and comfort over time eventually became, pretty easy to do. But I think the class size, when you can't really disappear as much in the whole group, then there were some people who definitely had some challenges speaking up, but even over time, like even the most quiet people in the room eventually had something to contribute, because I think it just kind of created a space where they felt comfortable to do so. So I don't know.
That's super interesting. One of our big challenges, that we're thinking about going online potentially at any point, or teaching just a course online with dialogue. One of the big challenges is obviously making students felt like seen as people, and like they're in a personal relationship with instructors and other people in the course. And so one thing that's kind of coming out here, as you're describing the first couple of sessions, Jordan, is if you have groups that are small enough, and if everybody knows each other, and there are these just social pressures coming in that says like, you can't just like, sit there. You can't just kind of, sit in the back of the room or whatever. That can be helpful if a bit uncomfortable, or even if it's something to work through. So that's really cool. I mean, that's giving me like design ideas, like as we're speaking. But let me pitch this to you too. You've now mentioned a couple of times the kind of culture that gets built up around dialogue. I know for our students, there's a very distinctive, very bizarre, in a good way, culture. Like we have people like shouting "corrupt the youth" on the quad every now and then. We're like, yeah, it must be our people. We have stickers. We make stickers is a really big part of the culture. I'm wondering, anything like that you guys have experienced, any sort of culture building that's happened at MSU? And I guess this kind of ties into a broader question I have, is just like, what are your students like? Whereas Sam was describing Notre Dame students as very polite and professional and, tryhards, is that strivers? I don't know, ambitious. What is the culture of the school like, and how does the dialogue culture fit into that broader ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are so many smaller pockets of different kinds of culture at MSU. It's like very diverse in a lot of different ways. And in the classroom, in this intro class at least, you had kind of a wide scope of people from all different kinds of backgrounds there. So it kind of brings to mind like a sort of pre-existing culture around dialogue of like, you can't disagree. And I don't know that a lot of people had that, but coming into the space and being able to have differing opinions and different backgrounds and different ideologies about the world, maybe the culture that gets created is like, oh, it's okay for us to have differences because we can just be in conversation about it. But yeah, I don't know if we've ever come to a point of having people like gathering on the quad as philosophy nerds shouting
Yet.
but yeah, exactly. This is the beginning.
That's right. It's a
Yeah.
movement. You guys are starting a movement.
Yeah, we just had one small class.
Yeah.
Following up on that, I think one thing it does do is, because we have students coming from a bunch of different backgrounds. We have veterans, non-traditional students, some students fresh out of high school, parents. Those aspects wouldn't always come into the course or come up, in a standard philosophy course. But I think one thing about these exercises in dialogue is that it allows students to draw on more of their personal experience and then compare and see, because you've got really a wide variety, as Jordan was saying, of cultures and backgrounds that students can meaningfully draw on in that kind of setting that they wouldn't necessarily when we're just, say, going through Aristotle's function argument.
Totally. I do that though, like in grad seminars, be like, as a dad, like, that's just me though. Yeah, I like that. So, okay, one thing you guys both mentioned is the way in which dialogue might help difference of opinion or background be more of an asset than a liability in a philosophy course. And that's really cool and interesting. I think I sometimes encounter the perception that dialogue is going to lead to more relativism, like in not like a sophisticated, interesting philosophical sense, but just kind of a bland sense. Like, well, if you're dialoguing, then everybody's going to think like, well, it's just all about our opinions or whatever. But what I find is that students that go through the dialogue come out more willing to articulate and defend and argue their views, because I think you both have said this, they do that and they realize like the world didn't end. Not every, like, people don't hate me. I can do that in a respectful way and sort of do it in a truth-seeking way. Am I just sort of like reading this in as like a hopeful professor, or is that a real sort of observation? Is this really picking up on things that you guys were both talking about?
No, I would say that that's a real thing, even just in my own experience as a philosophy student. But I mean, you're in a position to have to grapple with ideas that, like, some of these authors are so direct and clear and very much on their point about what they see the world as. And so if that's different than your view, then you're kind of forced to have to, I don't know, reconcile with that or like hold it along with yours. And so you do get not only your own views reinforced, but the ability to talk about maybe why that's the case or why you disagree with this thing, instead of having that be something of maybe just your feelings and opinions. Like, I just think that's a dumb idea. You're kind of like, okay, well, since I've been presented with all of these specific points, maybe I need to kind of understand my views better so that I can also be so clear with like the presentation of my own ideas, if that makes sense. So I think that's something that's happening. And even throughout the semester, you can kind of see students much more like articulate about their ideas and a lot more confident. I think you said that, confident, just talking about what they believe in a clear, direct way.
That is like music to my ears. I love that. That's amazing. And it's my experience as well, seeing that transformation in students. Sam, what do you think? You got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think definitely all of that. I would echo all of that. The other thing I would just say is like, in terms of like the charge of like relativism or whatever, I think one thing that dialogue can also do is make you like question your beliefs, because you're hearing beliefs from everybody else. So that can lead to kind of uncertainty, at least at first. But that wouldn't like ultimately jump to the conclusion of like, everything's just opinion, like who cares? It's more of like, oh, like I never thought about it that way, or like I just realized now that I've been raised Catholic my whole life, and so I'm Catholic, but I never really stopped to question, like, do I actually believe the things that are involved in the Catholic faith? So it can lead to kind of like uncertainty and questioning, but not to this whole like, it's just a matter of opinion.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and
yeah.
well, just to follow up on this, and what Jordan was mentioning is specifically too, is that's part of why I'm selecting some of the course readings that I do. So, I mean, Aristotle talking about the mean, you know, that most people can get along with a lot of that stuff. But when we come to the Pali Canon Buddhist views or Blaise Pascal, then it's just harder to be like, oh no, we're all just diverting ourselves away from our misery that we're constantly in, or, you know, we should completely get rid of desire and craving, and that's the only way to reach enlightenment. I think it's just harder for students to not, like, you might feel like, well, we just have, that's the class, we have to go along with that. But especially when you're talking about it with other students, I think then you're like, do we do we want to go along with this?
Yeah.
So choosing some views that might seem more extreme relative to sort of conventional perspectives where students are coming from is part of what informs the way I set up my version of the course.
Yeah, just to add to that, I know, Paula, you also love this unit, right? The nihilism section of our course. Yeah, it's like one of the best, because for that same exact reason, it's like so out there to these students, and they're like, oh, like I have to respond to this. Like I need to figure out a way out of this. And they don't just like accept it completely. They're like, wait, like how do I respond to this? Like what's my way out of this tight argument of nihilism? So yeah.
I always introduce that class by showing the short film by David Lynch called Rabbits. I encourage you guys to watch this if you want nightmares for the rest of your life. But yeah, we talk about different kinds of nihilism and nihilism about meaning in life. And anyway, it's a trip. I was going to say too. Let's see. Actually, here's another question for both of you. One thing that often gets brought up when I talk about dialogue is a fear that students are going to overshare, or that like issues will arise that are just like beyond the scope of things that we should expect undergrad staff to deal with. And, you know, without getting into specifics or anything like that, you know, has that come up, or have there been really scary situations in dialogue, or even just weird situations in dialogue? And, or like, how did you sort through those? Or has that not been the case? There just hasn't been that many situations you haven't known how to deal with?
I'll start and answer this one first, but in my experience, at least this last semester, I don't think we came up to any weird or scary scenarios, but I think discussing as a class the mores or the standards or like agreements for the community beforehand really helped. And some of those could even be like, let's try to limit our answers to just a couple minutes so everyone can have a chance to speak. Really, that created a tidy space for all this stuff to work out in. And so like I can imagine that maybe coming up, but it seems like when you set that tone together as a group, like you can kind of avoid hopefully having to get into these really, I don't know, scary situations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the norms or mores you called them are super important for this. One that I often use is the WAIT rule, which stands for why am I talking? Which is basically just like an informal check on people who are like oversharing or rambling or something. In terms of like sticky situations or anything, haven't really had much come up. I had one student one year who came out in the class to everybody, and on Notre Dame's campus, that's like a little bit taboo, you know, because it's a Catholic university and everything. But at that point, we had already established such a like safe space and such a community with each other that she felt comfortable sharing that, and everyone around her, like, it just went perfectly, you know, it went very well. And so like creating that culture at the beginning sets a tone for like very comfortable sharing if something gets personal or anything like that.
I like too. I totally didn't prep you guys on this or ask you to say it, but mentioning the norms and the mores and everything at the beginning, I mean, that's certainly a huge part of our culture and our training at Notre Dame. And in surprising ways, that comes to help later in the semester. I've started doing this with everything. Like I do it with my kids, you know, like at the start of a camping trip or like any group of people. We do it at the office, you know, when we're talking about how we're going to approach some big project. It just helps so much. It feels like 20 or 40 minutes of wasted time in the moment sometimes. I mean, I think those activities are fun, but like sometimes we're like, why are we doing this? But then you hit a point where there's some sort of conflict or miscommunication, and you can just point back to the norms that you've explicitly agreed to and then modify them or not, or just say like, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. So I don't know, I find those super helpful. And it's really awesome to hear that you know, that's again, something you guys found helpful as well. Yeah, what else? What are you thinking, Caleb? It's a great interview question. What's in your head? What's in your brain right now?
Let me look around inside. I guess one thing that I'm trying to figure out, and maybe is a challenge, we don't have, as you know, I was teaching 30 people, not hundreds. So one challenge potentially for us going forward is figuring out how to recruit enough to have two discussion leaders for one or if I'm teaching multiple sections. So I'd say that's something that on our campus, and probably at a lot of schools with smaller philosophy departments, that can be maybe a little more of a challenge or something to watch out for. But hopefully, like if Jordan has a good experience, then she can share that. And but that's one challenge. And then
yeah, any thoughts too from the two of you? How would you recruit other students if you were us?
Oh, if you wanted to go ahead, Sam, you can.
No, go ahead, Jordan.
Okay. I think what comes to mind for me is that if there was a way to present the opportunity and also these classes as like enriching for students' lives, I guess that's the perspective that philosophy probably often takes, but I feel like when a student can see themselves in the class, or they can see that it's going to have some benefit to them, because you have to take so many general studies or so many electives. So like what makes an intro to ethics course like stand out as something interesting to you? And partly that could be just talking about what sorts of things we're going to discuss. Maybe I didn't even actually really know what I was going to be getting into when I signed up for an intro to ethics class at first. And I was surprised that it had to do with things that were so immediate and important to my actual daily life. And so something there, I feel like there's an important connection where if someone can get like, okay, if I take this course, not only do I get the credit, but my life is going to be changed or improved, then that's going to be more incentive. So I don't know how you would actualize that, but
yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I think that's good. One note that I thought of while Jordan was talking is don't name your course just Intro to Ethics. Like name it something like What is the Good Life or something like that, something that's more engaging. that's going to attract people's attention when they're just sifting through hundreds of general education courses. And then just like advertising on campus too, in that vein of like that this is going to like not just be a course that you take, but something that will actually like markedly improve your life, would I think attract more people. Yeah, it's hard for me to think just because like Paul has probably said, we've never like had that kind of problem because I guess we have the privilege of it being a required course and hundreds of students take it.
That's right. And then one thing we do too is we think of the students who's taken the course as like our pool of potential fellows. And so we really build that up. We even give surveys sometimes at the end of the year and just ask the students, like, indicate if you're interested in being contacted in the future about the fellows program, kind of keep a listserv. I don't know. We do a lot of like marketing tactics, I guess.
Yeah, and we have the dialogue leaders as well will talk to people in their discussion groups and say like, hey, I think you'd be really good for this role. You should consider applying and things like that. So yeah, that's a great resource for sure.
Yeah, and I think those are all good. It's just a little when the pool is 30 students, and that's a little different.
Yeah.
And then there are some my colleagues aren't all ready to commit to teaching Introduction to Ethics as about the good life. So that's, I can advertise my section of the course like that, but not all the faculty have done that. So that's something that's, depending on your institutional and departmental context, it can make it a little tricky than when you have the whole course and the support for that set up.
One thing that we keep talking about, and I want it to happen, but I don't want to have to do all the legwork. This is my whole life. I just like sit in my armchair. I'm like, it'd be great if that happened, is making a student group that is God and the Good Life. So even if you're not a fellow, you can just be in the student group that does kind of God and the Good Life-y kinds of things. And one model I was thinking is, I don't know if we still have a philosophy club on campus. I think we probably do. Maybe, I don't know if we do. But I was thinking we could totally take over, right? Just get like 4 or 5 people in there, get them in leadership, and then just change the name of it. So I don't know if this is a model. I don't know, Caleb, if there's a philosophy club at MSU, but maybe thinking about having a parallel structure or some formal relationship or informal with this philosophy club or a student-led organization, that could be a good feeder into these kinds of programs too, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. And we have, it kind of depends on the year. It fluctuates how well the club's set up, but I think that's a natural place to look for outreach. Like, here are people who are interested in discussing it on their own, and so you've got potential leaders and people who might know other leaders or specifically students interested in this kind of version of the course. Yeah.
All right, so here's a question for Sam and Jordan. I guess Caleb, I don't know, it's a question for everybody. We talk a lot about asking strong questions as dialogue leaders, and the importance of making sure that you're asking questions that are somewhat, open-ended. They're not just yes or no, or like, they aren't the sort of thing that somebody could just be like, but they're open-ended, and there are things that you're really curious about, things that you really want to know the answer to. And the sort of question you might ask at a, we say dinner party, or, if you're just socializing, you're hanging out with your friends, you would actually ask them, you'd be really interested in their answer to it. Now, it's really hard to come up with these off the top of my head. What I'm wondering is if anybody has a good example of kind of a go-to strong question that they use in dialogue, or a question that they've asked and has just really generated a lot of student interest. The only ones I can think of all have to do with death. I've just been writing about death lately. So I'm not going to be a downer and ask one of those, but any kind of go-to question or even prompt or technique that you guys find just like, okay, if I walk into a room, I know I can start with this and we're just going to like, just go from there. Totally putting you on the spot, but any thoughts?
I have 2 thoughts to start. One question that's an easy icebreaker in any conversation with anybody is, have you had any interesting dreams lately? Because somebody's just going to go off. Like, that happens every time without fail. Everybody's got an interesting dream story. So that's a great one to just like start a conversation. One thing that I do in my dialogue groups very often is start with the Notre Dame campus and then build it out to like the world around it. So like, for example, one of the years, like the first 2 weeks of class, all the guys sat on one side of the classroom and all the girls sat on the other side of the classroom. And like, if you don't know, Notre Dame has separate boys and girls dorms, and like a lot of the structured activities on the campus are kind of like gendered in ways like that. So I just like made it explicit that they had just sat for 2 weeks in a row as all boys and all girls. And I was like, well, what's the deal with that? Like, why are you guys doing that? And then we had like this very interesting conversation about gender norms on campus and kind of the expectations around gender on campus. And that expanded into like gender norms in the country, and kind of like expectations about masculinity and femininity. So like starting from some small point, especially like the college campus that you're on, and then expanding it out is always a great way to like get the ball rolling.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Gosh, that's a big one to top. But I think I like that approach of keeping it on a smaller level first and then bringing it out. One thing that Caleb did in my first semester, and I'm not sure if that's a thing that you do in all of your classes, but asking what we personally believe is overvalued or undervalued. And I like to ask people in general, like, what are the things you value most in life, or what are your, I guess, top virtues or something like that. And then it just allows someone to take a moment and kind of internally look. And then when you're in a conversation about it in class, especially when you're maybe asking in the broader context of like, what do we as a society value or undervalue? And so, yeah, I don't know. I like that approach, but that is a tough question, Paul. So
No, those are great. Those are really interesting. I want to return to that question in a second. I'm going to ask you, Caleb, what do you think is undervalued just in the world of anything? But actually, let's see. This is sort of connected with some of these thoughts here. I think a lot of professors are eager this semester to get their students talking about potentially controversial topics. Like we all feel like we need to get our students talking about the pandemic and ethics around that, or about race and about what's going on in the country, or about economic disparity. I mean, there's just like, there are so many things in the headlines every day that are philosophical or have some sort of philosophical issues connected up with them, and that we sense that our students want to talk about, but we're terrified to like jump in and actually get them to talk about those things. Or we think like if we start the conversation, we don't know where it's going to go, and we're just terrified of it. So one question I have for the two of you is, obviously it sounds like dialogue is a good route into some of those issues and conversations. But any thoughts in particular as to whether this sense that students want to talk about those things is true? Is that right? Or do students just not want to think about all of the things going on in the world? Would they rather, think about Descartes and dreaming and something else? So that's the first part. And then the second thing is is that the sort of thing that like in dialogue, you think, yeah, we could approach some of these questions about gender or race or, pandemic ethics or whatever. Yeah, less of a question, more of just a stream of words to inspire words from you. What do you think?
Jordan, I want to throw that to you first as the current student.
Sure, yeah. I think it's hard to say for all students, and I would imagine there's kind of a mix of the people who it's like, I'm just trying to focus on getting done with my classes now. I don't want to think about all of this stuff. But then on the other hand, especially as a young person in this country and a young student, it's like these are things we have to be thinking about and talking about. And as far as dialogue being a good access to that, I definitely think that it is. And having like a leader in the room who's willing to talk about those things first and introduce controversial ideas, I think can give people permission almost. Like when we're in a group context, it's like you want to make sure you're acting appropriately. And so you're not going to be the first person to raise your hand and be like, let's talk about whether or not there's an afterlife or something. And so if you instead are going to introduce like if you introduce like some John Stuart Mill or something, and he's talking about liberty, and it's like all of a sudden now we're in this kind of intense discussion about like what does it mean to be an individual, and then you can go from there. And since he's like a thought leader or someone who's already kind of maybe establishing some kind of claim there, and then you have someone who you can look up to, like your professor or this designated peer leader, then it's like, okay, maybe this is the kind of space where I can at least ask the questions or start the conversation. So dialogue has a part of that, but so does like someone in a leadership position willing to like open that door too.
That is really cool. That was like, I just want to like contemplate that. There were so many good things in there. Thank you. That was awesome. Sam, you got thoughts?
Yeah. I'm not really sure what to think about whether people would want to talk about COVID when they get on campus, because obviously I'm sure they've been having tons of conversations about it for months now. But like, if they were willing, and this would just be something that I would ask my students, like I wouldn't talk about it first week, and then I would just ask them after in like a self-assessment form that we use sometimes, or just like at the end of the dialogue meeting, what kind of things do you want to talk about? And if they say like, we want to talk about coronavirus, then we'll do that in future weeks. But I definitely think dialogue is a great way of having these conversations if they are willing. And Jordan brought up a great way of doing that, of just like starting with yourself and your experiences, or starting with the philosophical text that's like a leader on this topic, are great ways to do it. And then just the things that we were talking about earlier of starting from personal experience of the students, and then starting from like smaller on-campus things maybe, and then expanding out to the country, rather than just starting with just starting with like the broad issue. Start with like campus and build it out.
I think it's so important for me to remember how much vulnerability it takes to answer some of these questions. Been in philosophy so long, like if anybody asks me what I think about anything, I just start shouting. And so I forget, as a freshman in college, walking into a philosophy classroom, and even the prospect of thinking that the professor might call on me and ask me to talk about something in the text, which it could have just been like Aquinas on love, but I'd be like, oh my gosh, like talking about love in front of people, that can be terrifying. And to have somebody, a dialogue leader who's their peer and willing to model and sort of be an exemplar there. Or even I like too how you kind of kicked it up to the responsibility up to the professors and everybody involved in the teaching and instruction. I mean, everybody's got to sort of demonstrate this kind of vulnerability. That's really important. I think too, you're right, Sam. I'm not going to bring up the pandemic for a couple of weeks at least. I'm just going to pretend like everything's normal through my face mask. So it looks like there's some activity here that I got to check out on this updating question sheet. Sorry, there's a document where somebody's typing in some thoughts and questions. So while I do that, I'm going to look away for a second. Don't be freaked out. But I want to know, Caleb, what do you think is undervalued?
So, I mean, one thing I keep coming back to and thinking about in my own life is attention. I mean, in some ways, it's valued very much by Facebook and lots of companies who are trying to monetize it. But thinking about, well, part of what's effective about dialogue is just when you see someone really paying attention to you and your views, even if they disagree with you, like having that attention, and it's so central to education, and why I think it's hard. There are a lot of challenges with online stuff, and then just thinking in ordinary life, like what do my kids, when am I doing well as a parent? It's when my kids really feel that attention and love, and whereas even if I'm doing things for them, but I'm distracted or on my phone or and there are so many things that make it hard for us to really focus our attention and its quality. That's at least something I've personally been thinking a lot about.
Man, that hits home. I feel seen right now, Caleb. I have this, yeah. The other day I was in the house and my son is like, are you gonna bring your phone outside when we go? And I was like, no, I put it down. And he just started shouting, woohoo, dad doesn't have to do work. And I was like, oh, wow. That's rich. This is so great. This is awesome. I mean, it is a dialogue. We're now dialoguing. All right. Any thoughts, Sam or Jordan, about attention, the value of it and the ways we think about it? the context of dialogue or anything, we're off the rails now. We can talk about whatever we want.
I think that was a really interesting direction to take that question, I think. And yeah, I think it kind of is something we take for granted, attention. And it's like you said, especially in an academic environment, it's so important. And just in everyday life, like being present and like involved with what's going on instead of this world on our phones or on our computers. I don't know, a lot can pass you by. So I would definitely agree with you, Caleb, that it's undervalued unless you, of course, are like in marketing or something like that, or trying to make something of it in that way.
Then you're valuing it in the wrong way. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
Wait,
I
Sam.
definitely did not think that that was the direction that you were going to go with that, Caleb, but it was very interesting. And yeah, I'd say like that's something that a lot of students at Notre Dame, like I feel like lose sight of, especially like during school. You know, you're so focused on your studies and then getting a job afterwards and stuff. And like the atmosphere at Notre Dame is very like professional oriented. Excuse me. So like they're very focused, hyper focused on like the next steps always, and it can be hard to like get them to stop and just like pay attention to the moment that they're having right now, or the conversation that they're having right now. So yeah, I think that's great.
That's awesome. And I don't want to get too meta. I hate it when people get too meta, but I do want to point out that I asked a question. It was your question, Jordan, and it was a strong question. We were surprised by the answer that was given. There was a lot of substance to it. And the follow-ups, I mean, the directions you guys are taking this question in are awesome and could form the basis. I could talk for 4 hours, don't worry, I'm not going to, about either of the directions that you brought that in. I mean, is it a problem of technology in the world and the value around you and what you're most attentive to? Is it a problem of professionalization and career and sort of good life direction? And I can just totally see how you reflecting that back to Caleb in each of your own ways could just totally awaken something in me as a student in a room where people are dialoguing, where I would just think like, I want to go on this rant about phones, or like, you know, I really want to like see what other people think about the professionalization. Like, should we all just quit? Should we like move to the woods? I one time, okay, this is way off the rails, but I'll tell you, last thought is I one time in my class, we were talking about burnout and the meaning of work. And I described to the class a friend of mine who had just like quit his job and moved into the woods and was surviving on nuts and berries. And I got a standing ovation, just not me, the guy. I mean, they just started clapping and they stood up. And I was just like, that just tapped into something. I have to send an email to the dialogue fellows and tell them like, you guys got to talk about burnout and also make sure these people are not going to just move into the woods. Cause like, you know, that'd be a bad outcome for all involved. Okay. I don't know. Yeah. I see you, Caleb. Like, would it? Okay. I want to thank you guys. This was phenomenal. This was really fun to talk and to dialogue about these topics, and the perspective that you bring as dialogue leaders, as fellows, and as students is incredibly valuable. And all of the experience that you have in these programs. Thank you, Caleb, for being willing to talk about all this stuff. I think obviously if anybody has follow-up questions for any of us, they should feel free to post these in the comments, and we can find you answers, or we can connect somehow. I'm going to, I had an exit strategy, but now I've just totally forgotten it because my mind's been blown. But I think the exit strategy was to say, thank you all for joining me, and have a great afternoon. So thank you all for joining me.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.